You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always. This week we have another leader in the industry joining us for the conversation. She's been on that many boards that we're going to take the whole episode talking about it, but she's also leading in our design space, chair of Landgate. So many great things to talk about today where we can delve into some new perspectives about how the industry is going from a bandwidth perspective, from a design perspective, a policy perspective, and what the future looks like as well. So we have Kylee Schoonens, principal at Rothelowman, in the studio. Thanks for coming in, Kylee.
Thanks, Trent. Thanks for having me.
It's been a long time coming since I've wanted to get you on, since we first met a couple of years ago, and I thought this would be a perfect time to get you on after having a bit of some dense chat about market analysis recently and policy, some suburb spotlights, and showcase a fantastic female leader in this industry, trailblazing just like a few others we've had, and tell your story, but also share some great insights into what's going on in the market right now, given how many boards you were sitting on.
Thank you very much, Trent. My career has been very diverse, I guess you could say. You're right. It's been a bit of a journey that I've been on over the last few years.
Where'd that journey start?
I always knew that I wanted to be an architect, even through high school. I think I was about 11, actually, when I decided I wanted to be an architect, and did a lot of art and STEM classes and tech drawing, things like that through school. So I knew straight away going into architecture was my thing. So I did that straight after school. Spent 5.5 years doing my degree. I studied at Curtin.
A heavy drop-off rate in architecture.
It is.
I remember speaking to Jimmy Thompson at MJA a couple of years ago.
Yes.
Very different personalities between the two of you, but obviously both very high-performing architects.
Yes.
A lot of mates in your first year don't make it to year 3 or 4, do they?
They do not. In fact, I remember the first year there was about 100 people in the course. That had dropped down to probably 30.
Is that by design, you think?
I think some people come into architecture expecting it to be something that it's not. But they'll move into aligned courses or they'll go try different things. So really the ratio was 50% men and women, but the majority of the women moved into interior architecture. By the end of it, the architecture degree, there was maybe 30% women, I'd say. That changes now. I know the graduate rate these days is about 50-50 men and women graduating from architecture. From the original cohort, there would have been maybe 10 of us that graduated at the same time. Others took a little bit longer to graduate, but there was certainly big changes in that as we went through.
So you jump into industry.
Yes.
How hard is it to get a job as a graduate architect back then, maybe compared to today?
The way that I did it, and this is the way that I would recommend anyone who's studying architecture, is I actually worked all the way through university. I took on jobs with architecture firms making models, doing hand drawings, doing whatever work experience I could.
Cheap labour.
I was cheap labour, pretty much. And
it's a foot in the door, though.
It absolutely is. And particularly with your CV, when you actually get to the time of graduating, I had 3 years of experience working in architecture firms. I actually had to work a second job. So I worked in a couple of bars in the city while I was studying. That was how I made the money to get through uni, and doing work as a student, it was minimum pay. But it definitely got me the foot in the door, and also the experience that when I did graduate from university, I was able to jump into projects a lot faster. And we actually do that now with our student program at Rothelowman. We actually like to have students that come in and they work with us not only through university, but extend all the way through as graduates. And we've had a lot of success with that across the country. But that wasn't what I was doing back then. It was over 20 years ago now.
And one of the cool things about being an architect, just like being a developer, I guess, is that over that time you are able to start driving down streets and going, I did that one, I did that one, and start to recognise how you're shaping the face of Western Australia.
Yes, it's great. In fact, I love it when we drive down streets and my kids start to point them out now as well, which is kind of special.
Now, we will talk more about the architecture side as we progress. Obviously, it's your position as principal at Rothelowman these days. But I want to quickly touch on the boards you've sat on over time, both for a bit of context for us, but also for those people thinking about how I'd like to be on a board one day. Being on the board at Landcorp, the MRA, Bethany, Dev WA, brands that everyone listening would know about, and you're also now the chair at Landgate. How did it go getting that first gig? Someone tap you on the shoulder and then did it just roll on from there?
Architecture, I've obviously been doing that for close to 25 years now, but
It becomes bread and butter.
Exactly. But advocacy has been a very strong, important part for me, both in architecture and in property. And I guess I've always done extracurricular work outside of being involved in committees. Even from uni days, I was involved in CASA and SONA. I was involved in Imagine, the Emerging Architects Graduation Network. I was on chapter council with the Institute of Architects. I've been heavily involved with the Property Council, doing residential committee, division councils. All of these are volunteer roles that helped not only inform me as an architect and as a person generally invested in the Perth property industry on the issues and opportunities to enhance the industry. It gave me a different point of view as to how I could make a greater impact outside of architecture.
Gives you purpose.
Yeah, it gives purpose and a bit of give back as well. And that, I guess, naturally progressed. But what I wanted to move into was taking on non-executive director roles. This was my early 30s, and I thought, when I, once I get into my 40s, I might have a bit of extra time to, just find some non-exec director roles. Wasn't any more specific than that. My LinkedIn profile was picked up by a recruiter when I was in my mid-30s. In fact, I just had my first baby. And this recruiter contacted me and said, we've looked at your profile and we're working on behalf of a board looking for new directors. Would you be interested? It's looking at a property-focused role. We know that you don't have direct board experience right now, but you do have all of this other experience that you've been doing all these advocacy roles. Now, a part of me said, don't be ridiculous. You've just had a baby. Why would you think about doing this when you're already running your own business? But the other part of me said, this sounds like an amazing idea. And in fact, it's probably about 5 or 6 years earlier than I would have liked to do it in reality. But I never say no to an opportunity.
I think a lot of people in their 30s also would say, am I ready? Am I good enough?
Exactly.
What can I offer?
Exactly right. For me, I was just like, this is amazing. I'll just say yes and work it out.
Yeah, what's the downside?
Exactly. From there, that was Bethany. I did my AICD role, which is Australian Institute of Company Directors. And from that came the role with Landcorp. It's almost like there's once you're in the roles and you're doing it, there's a lot of referrals and the recruiters know who you are.
A lot of crossover, a lot of people on both boards.
Correct.
I'm sure you've been on the same board with a few people
Exactly.
quite often.
Exactly. And you get your foot in the door and there's lots of conversation. So it's about getting that foot in the door, really. So Landcorp came about 6 months after that for about 3 years, which is now DevWA. As a non-executive director, you are not a full-time employee of that organisation, but you go in for board meetings, committee meetings, and you have a fixed term as a director. They vary, generally 3 to 4 years, and you have the opportunity to extend that. So a normal board tenure might be 6 to 8 years. At that point in time, this was 2018, I was running Fratelli Group. I was on the board of Bethany. I was on the board of Landcorp and MRA. It was a pretty full bucket.
And a young mum.
Doable,
clearly.
I had a lot of support, and I still do have a lot of support from my family to be able to do that.
And that's obviously progressed over the years into ending up as being chairperson at Landgate.
Yes.
What do you do as chairperson at Landgate? And for those listening who may not have a lot of context, what does Landgate do on a daily basis these days? What is the role?
Landgate reports to the Minister for Lands. We are the WA Government's digital land agency. We are responsible for securing land interest, property values, registrations, certificates of titles, dealing with all the digital property information. So we have the state's digital cadastre map. I think a lot of people who are investing in property will often go looking on maybe the council's maps or the Landgate maps to find out information that they need about titles and surveys and all the features and all of those sorts of things.
It's a pretty thorough system, really, when we think about the information available in Western Australia on land interest, who owns it, what you paid for it, when you bought it, all these sort of things. You don't see that across any other jurisdiction in the country.
No.
It's pretty unique what is offered in terms of information in Western Australia.
Correct. The fact that we deal with all of the titling, all the valuations, all the mortgages and all the land information, it's a really important step in the land development process.
Well, it's essentially the gatekeeper, really. When I think about Strategic's relationship with Landgate from a surveying perspective, if any T hasn't been crossed or I hasn't been dotted, that information gets sent back and they say, do it again, make sure it's proper, otherwise we won't register it. If a settlement, for example, is missing a piece of information, all that information must be proper and ready to go with Landgate before a title is registered, transfers are effected. A lot of power is held, a lot of responsibility is held at Landgate. And with all that data, for example, a lot of transactions obviously occurring, a lot of money being spent at Landgate every day in terms of ordering titles, piece of information, whatnot. It's a real financial powerhouse for the state, isn't it?
It is, definitely. And we see the importance of that and really understand that we are a very necessary part in that cycle for the government.
So what does the chairperson do at Landgate?
The board is responsible for setting the strategic direction for Landgate. I have 5 other board members that sit with me. We are all professionals, we non-exec directors, but we all work in or around the property industry. I liaise with the CEO. We have a new CEO, Trish Scully, who was appointed about 2 weeks ago. Work with Minister for Lands, Minister Carey, ensuring that the government's vision for Landgate is successfully undertaken.
Cheeky question. Timeframes for titles to be registered at the moment?
Yes.
It's about as long as I think it's ever been. Obviously a lot of demand for Landgate services right now.
Yes.
Anything being done to try and get that number back down to a more manageable couple of weeks rather than month?
Absolutely. Our new title creation currently sits around 16 to 18 working days. It's actually been like that probably since the beginning of the year. We have had a few spikes.
It was 25 a few weeks ago.
It was 25, and we work really hard to bring that back down as quickly as possible. And the volume has increased substantially, as you can imagine. With
land development?
Land development, new lots, new titles, remortgaging and valuations and those sorts of things. Just to give some context, in 2022-23 financial year, we had just over 24,000 lots being created. In financial year 23-24, that was up to just under 27,500. So that just in the sheer volume is something. But what we are actually doing is we are working on a way to automate digital plan lodgement. Currently, it's a manual process. When we have a new title application submitted, they are prioritised and they're examined, and then they're sent to the WA Planning Commission within 4 days. Then there is a number of processes that come back from planning, and there's in that time as well where you might have queries raised, or there might be something if there's potential issues, but then that comes back to Landgate, and we generally see it sitting around about 16 days. What we are actually doing at the moment is we have a digital plan lodgement project which we are currently undertaking, and we anticipate that on completion of that project, probably somewhere in the order of the next 12 to 18 months, digital plan data will be able to be used to develop automatic new title creation.
Automatic's a lot quicker than 16 days.
It certainly is. So, because at the moment, new titles is a manual process. And it requires, obviously, a lot of skilled people.
Very diligent attention to detail. People checking.
Very focused. Currently, what we're actually doing in the short term is we're cross-training people to have plan examination and new title creation so that they have those multiple skill sets.
More flexibility so you don't have silos or spikes.
Absolutely,
Yep.
Absolutely. And we're also looking at ways to create a new process to have more simpler modification and removal of easements and covenants. So again, we're looking at ways to simplify the development process, particularly when it comes to the development of some of our brownfield sites and some more infill sites that we need as well.
And most people might not recognise this, but a critical part in the time frame of just getting your subdivision done, whether you're doing a 2-lot subdivision or a 200-lot subdivision, that a lot of people don't really factor in is the time it takes to go from getting your clearances with Council and Western Power and Water Corp, getting that through WAPC, and then you go, oh, great, we're ready to go. And now we have to wait for Landgate. If that side of things can be automated, because it really is a very functional side where a layperson would say, why does it take so long? Most of the time of a subdivision, Kylee, as you would know, if it takes 12 months, I'd say probably 4 of them are people doing work.
Correct.
The rest of it is just waiting for people to do work.
Exactly. And we recognise that. And so that's why this program that we are undertaking, the first step in it is to ensure that we can have those plans lodged digitally as well.
Now, you mentioned PCA being on the residential committee there. From your perspective, how's the advocacy going at the moment? It feels like we had a really big 2023 pushing a point on a lot of policies. 2024 seems to have been more of a head down, bums up year of people just getting on, especially, people in the committee just working their own jobs every day as well. Just trying to get lots out, trying to get houses built, trying to get apartments approved. It feels like slightly less advocacy has been happening this year compared to last year. That might just be on the surface of things. Maybe in the background, a lot of conversations are still being had. What's your update, your perspective on what's being achieved right now in conversation with government on how we are better streamlining our ability to deliver the houses we are not currently delivering?
The Property Council released their election platform earlier this year. The hard work put into that is really now paying dividends for the new team. Obviously, we've got a new executive director there, new deputy executive director. And really, I think it's important for them and for the team that they're now making sure that the government understand and listen to what those election platform items are. We've obviously got an election coming up in March next year. And so
things start to get looked at when elections start to happen,
they
don't they?
do. And so now is the time that understanding the importance of those particular positions and the benefits, depending on whoever is elected next year, of ensuring that the positions that have been stated in the platform are well understood and hopefully all enacted.
Yeah, striking whilst iron's hot. And that's something, maybe a criticism that I've got of the government at the moment, is that certainly a lot of advocacy has been worked on over the last few years in this government term. And it feels like, let's say, if around numbers, we provided 10 solutions that would make massive impacts, we believe, on fixing these problems. The government's looked at it and gone, we've got 5 solutions that we're going to work with. Only one of them were ones that were actually suggesting, and 4 of them come out of crazy land somewhere that we hadn't actually been talking about at any point. And you sit there scratching your head going, were we asking for Airbnb incentives? I don't think that was something that we were asking for as an advocacy group. We were asking for XYZ though, and it doesn't seem like anyone's looked at that at government. That's a frustration of mine.
A really important part of government understanding the policies that are needed is ensuring that they have sufficient stakeholder engagement with industry and stakeholder groups, because often policies are introduced that, whilst may be well-meaning, haven't necessarily had the commercial lens placed over them. That if they had have been worked through and discussed, even just workshopped with industry advocacy groups saying, what do you think about this? They will find very quickly that the ideas work or that they don't work. I'm not saying that that's blanket across all government. I think that there has been some absolutely massive changes, very positive changes that have been introduced. I mean, you look at the planning reforms.
Yeah, planning reforms are probably the biggest benefits I think we've seen.
They've been
John
amazing.
Terry's led massively in that space.
Yes.
But I think there's also a recognition amongst industry. There's probably 100 things, 101 percenters, the death by 1,000 cuts that Megan Adair spoke to a PCA or UDIA forum about 3 years ago. And it's not just a couple of these things that need to be addressed. It's a material number of these things need to be fixed. And feels like we still have a long way to go, and the government's recognising that, hey, actually these aren't that hard to implement. Why aren't we looking at them? Let's get them done and just let the market get on with it. Instead, we're continually spending time talking about reforms that really could have been addressed a couple of years ago, it feels like.
I know. I think speed of reform change is really the thing, and that there's obviously, again, a lot of work required to get these things done, but it's also looking at ways that we can unlock opportunity as we move forward, particularly as we move into a more digital age. At Landgate, we see ourselves in this role as well as the government's digital land agency. So what do we need to do to help our minister ensure that he is able to deliver more housing, as an example?
The reforms that have been done, the projects that you're speaking about, those are material, tangible outcomes that will help. Part of, let's say it's a 12-month process, bring that last month down to a day.
Exactly. There's another 2 projects that are really exciting as well that we're doing at Landgate to assist with this. The first is the Strata Title Act review. Every 5 years we go through a statutory review of the Strata Titles Act. We want to ensure that as a part of this review, cost controls within strata schemes are improved. We want to ensure that living in apartments and living in stratas is really enhanced, and particularly as Western Australia is becoming more sophisticated in and needing to live in more dense environments.
Yeah. Messy though, isn't it, the Strata Titles Act, especially when you look at the outcomes on the ground when issues occur tangibly with a building.
Yes.
This just generally seems like a very complex problem to solve, both from a statutory point of view, but also all the way up to having strata managers that are licensed for starters. Correct.
Yeah, that is one of the other elements that's being explored in the Strata Title Act review, is how do we deal with the practice and standards of strata managers. And I guess we're able to learn lessons from other states.
That are ahead of us, probably
Correct.
a couple of decades in this space.
You travel to any capital city, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, as an example, their strata living is far more developed. So there are a lot of lessons that can be taken from those states. But also I think that the reforms that are being identified will allow for the government to meet their medium density development goals. So we're not just thinking big apartments, we're thinking triplexes, exactly. How do we deal with the small and the large?
And the goal is to streamline this, increase some standards, and prepare ourselves for what probably the next cycle should bring, is a new vogue of higher density living, really.
Absolutely.
Before we move on to the architectural stuff, tell me about Spatial WA.
It's really exciting, actually. Spatial WA is a whole of government program which is going to focus on the consolidation of the digital data that each government organisation holds and revolutionise the way that it's all brought together.
So like a harmonised mapping system?
If you like, it's essentially going to be a spatial digital twin for Western Australia.
Okay.
So what that means for us is that it will give us at our fingertips access to timely, authoritative data. It'll allow streamlining of planning approvals. It will allow us to respond to natural disasters faster. It'll be able to help us with building maintenance and infrastructure. It will provide information for all government agencies when they're looking to design major infrastructure.
So we're talking about a system where all of Western Power's assets, Watercorp's assets, Landgate's data points, they're all sitting on the same system.
So the state government has committed $140 million to cover 10 years of development of the digital capabilities.
Does this mean it's going to take that long before we see the benefits?
No, there are a number of gateways. So we are currently going through a procurement process to work with a delivery partner with Landgate. And once it is developed, it will scale up to allow for the public and private sector to be able to also come in and use the spatial digital twin. So there's obviously going to be a couple of years to be able to build what this actually looks like, but it will ultimately be the place for you and I to be able to go and access all of the information we need to be able to successfully design and develop projects.
Cutting down time, cutting down cost, risk, all those things.
This will be the most advanced spatial digital twin in Australia.
Let's segue into that built form space and talk a bit more about what you're up to and the demand you're seeing, where it's coming from, because it will indicate what's in the pipeline for Western Australia.
Definitely.
You're spending a lot of time at SDAU at the moment, SDRPs. How's that process been going, first off? Do you feel like it's working culturally? Is there a bandwidth capacity? Is there an issue in that space? What's been the dynamic from council to DAP to SDAU, I guess?
We've certainly found that since the 1st of March with the planning reforms and the new processes, the significant development pathway process through Department of Planning, that we are finding it much more streamlined. We're finding that there is a lot of projects that are going into the system. We're still navigating, like everyone, what that pathway is pre-lodgement, but then post-lodgement as well. And I really have to commend Department of Planning on their State Referral Coordination Unit. I think that they are doing a fantastic job, and it's such a good idea, and it's such a simple, beautiful idea. Why didn't we have it earlier?
So it's essentially they're actually herding the cats. That's the point, right?
Exactly.
And it should never have been like that. It should never have got to that cultural point where people aren't actually invested in being a part of the solution and not just being gatekeepers, which is what it felt like for so long.
Correct.
But when you start focusing on that culture of, yes, we can, how can we, rather than why should we? Then you start to see people actually doing their jobs and outcomes occurring.
Absolutely. And I think that's why so many people are actually looking at the significant development pathway as a process, because I think that unfortunately there's still a lot of local councils that are not listening to that mandate.
Not on board.
They're not on board.
So does that mean the SJU and even the DAP with its increased thresholds is possibly going to start having some bandwidth issues, being a victim of its own success?
I hope not. But I believe that resourcing, yes, exactly, the number of projects that will be coming through, I'm assuming that Department of Planning is already looking at how they scale up.
Well, you have to think rationally. If you're a professional in this space trying to get an outcome for your client, that's your job. That's what you're held to account on. Why would you ever choose to go through council ever again?
I don't think you would, really, if you could avoid it.
Yeah. And then by extension of that, your project's $20 million or more. DAP's still got a couple of councillors sitting on that panel.
Yes.
You go to SJU, don't you?
Yes, exactly. There's a number of gateways to go into the significant development pathway. The minimum construction threshold is $20 million, but you also need to demonstrate that the opportunity is, I guess, not necessarily there for you to take it through the JDAP process, whether there's a planning scheme that is outdated, or there are issues whereby the council and JDAP are not able to assess the application. Then it goes through to the SDP process. And I guess they've recognised as well that there are going to be a large range of projects that might actually come through, because 20 million is really, it's a pretty
these days. Yeah, you're not getting a lot for 20 million these days.
No, exactly. And they've certainly understood that and recognised that. And so State Government Architect has set a 2-tier system for assessing design review process to ensure a much more, again, streamlined approach to actually get it in for lodgement as well, which we're finding very successful so far.
Good. Well, that's important. From a principal who's obviously got a lot of these projects in her weekly diary right now,
yes,
to have positive things to say about the process, it's evidence that it's working.
It's definitely working, and I guess I'd love it to be able to continue working as well as it has. The way I love to work and our team loves to work is go in early, be really collaborative, ensure that we listen to the feedback from the design review, and then instigate those changes. It's important that the process doesn't get clogged up by long waiting periods between the ability to have design reviews, if that's the process that people go down.
Well, that's my concern,
yes,
Kylee, is that we speak about a regimented 4-month time frame between lodgement and outcome, but before then there's a pre-lodgement process that really I don't think has been signposted much, that even in my experience at the moment is probably just as long, waiting for a design review meeting.
Yes.
And those things are mandatory, and you sit there and you wait and you wait and you wait. And again, a lot of this time frame is just waiting for people to give you a time slot to review a design that in one example might not really be a residential outcome in the first place, might be a shopping centre or something like that, right?
Yes.
So some would say less sensitive in design in the first place. So
yes,
that would be my concern, is that even though we have statutory timeframes for assessment, the pre-assessment side blows out to a point where maybe that starts to get people to decide to go back into the DAP side. And maybe that's a good thing.
Potentially, exactly. I think the other risk is if the pre-lodgement, if people are left to wait too long, particularly if they want to engage early, that the design needs to continue to progress. So you can't just stop the clock and wait. I mean, you can, but that time is money, right?
Yep.
So whilst we want to be able to engage early and engage often, it really comes down to the availability of trying to get everyone together.
And these guys are all professionals, busy
exactly,
on a daily basis. You know, the most highly sought after people in WA often,
yes,
these SDAU level people, their diaries rarely correlating.
Exactly. It's definitely been a massive improvement on where it was, as long as everyone remains really flexible and open to feedback and how we can all assist everyone. Like we're all working towards the same outcome, right?
We want to be. And I think that's the whole point. The higher up you get, the more they get that.
Yes.
And the more we can keep operating in that space with that same culture, the better outcomes it's going to have for WA.
Exactly.
Talking about some of those projects and referencing cost escalations like we just did, I wanted to get some advice from you on how proponents might go about still achieving design excellence, but in a way that isn't blowing the budget out. We know essentially that in nearly every project in the apartment space in Perth right now, unless you're in the western suburbs or you're a massive developer with efficiencies, it doesn't stack up. It doesn't stack up in Morley. It doesn't stack up in Cannington. It won't stack up in Warwick. All these places, they're great ideas, they're great applications, nice to have them approved, but it's not working. How do we find that balance in Perth between wanting design excellence or wanting a beautiful looking building and not gold plating it to a point that no other city found necessary to build in their place around the world? You look at a lot of places in Western Europe, they're building rice bubble boxes that are extremely energy efficient. They don't care whether it's got cladding or this one's gold or this one's wood. They're building functional homes for people in the built form space. That doesn't seem to be our priority in Perth. Our priority seems to be how many times can we compete with Saudi Arabia for the most beautiful apartment building.
I think,
and that's the standard. Otherwise, it ain't getting approved.
Exactly. Well, it's getting harder and harder now to get projects to move into construction. And that is, as you say, it's getting really expensive to build projects.
And I guess you know that the second someone comes to you, you're already scratching your head thinking, is this ever going to get off the ground?
Well, the value is driven in a project in the concept design.
Or killed.
Exactly right. And it is, and this is what we always say to our clients, we drive the most value for you the moment we pick up a pencil. The value is not where you try and cut costs through doing value engineering and saving $5 million at the back of the project, because I think everyone's been experienced, particularly over the last few years, where construction prices have gone up so much that even if you spend 3 months trying to save
you're still
$1 million. Well, you don't actually save any money because the price has gone up more than it's just where you've tried to save. So for us, we are having a lot of success at Rothelowman. We start with what we call the beautiful plan. And that is, we drive efficiency through cost, obviously cost, but we drive more value through ensuring a very considered and refined, simple approach to planning, not being over the top in terms of facade treatments. The structure can be beautiful, using ways to be able to craft the architecture through the structure. We collaborate with our structural engineer from day one.
The structure is the design excellence in the first place. You can use that without having to go and put another layer, another skin on top that costs money.
In certain instances, I mean, 95% of the project cost you don't see. And that is, it's all covered up by plasterboard, you know, the structure, the services, all these things. That's where the majority of the cost is.
And time as well, delivery.
Time. Exactly.
And it's interesting, Kylee. I think some of the most beautiful properties we have in Perth, the ones that were built before design excellence and design review was a thing. They were built before architects were really required in the same way. The simplicity often is the most beautiful thing about a building, and we seem to continually be looking to reinvent the wheel. You can recognize when a house or an apartment building was built in 1990s versus 2000s versus 2010s versus 2020s, because the materiality is changing all the time. What's wrong with being content with simple, beautiful, refined, uniformed brickwork, for example, or concrete work, for example, that is just blending into the natural environment?
Exactly. Well, I think craftsmanship is what that comes down to. And we talk about how do we drive value through the creation of beautiful spaces. How someone lives within a space and experiences that space is how you actually create a beautiful building. And the refinement and the process, we start thinking about the structure of the building. How do we make the building from day one? If you don't think about how a building is going to be made from the moment you start putting lines on a page, you just add millions of dollars to the cost down the track, because it will become complex. In Perth, we've had that situation over the last decade. There were so many projects that didn't get built that had DAs, and even now, projects that were designed even a few years ago, people are struggling to get them to stack up.
How much of that do you think is inefficient design?
A lot. We've had a lot of success in our practice, and not just in Perth, but across Australia, of projects that may have stalled or had a DA that hasn't stacked up. And we've taken a different lens, a different approach to the design from the previous firm, whoever may have designed it, and recast it. And we've been very, very successful in increasing project yield in many instances and getting better returns for projects.
Do you think that's supported at a DRP level in Western Australia? Do you think that simplicity and function is adequately supported and encouraged compared to showmanship?
Yeah, it very much depends on the project, and I think it's really important that people who sit on the design review panel have at least one person on the panel had experience in delivering that typology.
I don't think we see a lot of that. I think most of it is theoretical knowledge and not enough people on DRPs that have actually struggled through the delivery side of things over the years as well.
Yes.
Much more practicing architects not on the DRPs than on the DRPs.
Exactly. Hopefully that will change because, again, if we look at Perth and how we are developing as a city, our built form has certainly evolved probably over the last, I'm talking more in the apartment space, maybe over the last 5 years. But if you compare where we are in our evolution as a city compared to cities that have greater populations like Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, our evolution as a more sophisticated international city is really in its infancy, and it's so exciting to be able to be a part of that and help to shape what Perth is going to look like. In terms of the apartment market, people living in Western Australia have seen apartment living as a second choice for forever. They've always seen living in...
It's a compromise.
Exactly, living in homes. Like you go rent in an apartment when you're in your 20s and then you move into a home out in the suburbs as you get a young family. But now that in 2024, we have seen the greatest influx of people moving into Western Australia probably in the last 10 years. So we have a lot more people moving here from interstate and from overseas. Property prices are becoming a lot more unaffordable for people to enter into the home market. Our city is sprawling beyond its possibilities. We are 140 kilometres long now. We're the size of Los Angeles, but we have 10% of the population. It's just becoming unsustainable for us to continue growing the extents, and we need to come back and build infill. And that leads to apartments, it leads to more dense living, it leads to more affordable options for people to live in Perth.
Everyone has to be part of that solution though, right?
Exactly.
Not only the planning system.
No.
But then also probably a recognition that as long as the input costs to build these things aren't going to go down, which evidence will show you they won't, they'll plateau and go up and plateau and go up.
Exactly.
The only way the population starts to justify this as an option is if at the very least the price of an established property is equal to, and if not more, than what it would cost to deliver and then sell at a profit for a developer an apartment building.
Exactly right.
And unfortunately, the reality still is, surprisingly, that for the most part in Western Australia, we ain't there yet. We have to increase our prices to get out of this.
Exactly right. But if you look at the number of eastern states investors that are buying into Western Australia right now, we are still affordable compared to the rest of Australia.
That's right. But 5 years ago, I don't think we ever would have expected that these would be the realities, that we would have the demand, we would have the need, the basic need for shelter. We wouldn't have the structural, financial and labour supply abilities to provide what a free market is currently being incentivized to provide.
It's been something that has been called out for a number of years. I know David Cresp at Urbis has been saying it for a long time that, we've had an undersupply of apartments compared to the population growth. But what's really interesting is that in every other capital city, home ownership being an apartment has not been considered second choice. It's always been considered a natural part of the evolution of living.
Just an alternative. And good design in apartments has been something that has been driven very heavily in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and now in Perth. And with the introduction of Design WA, our apartment design guidelines, we're seeing that the design of our apartments are becoming much more sophisticated. We talk about resorts in some levels.
Well,
now.
Exactly right.
Don't always have to be those, especially when we start getting into more suburban areas.
Exactly right. But you don't need to have all of the resort facilities, but you do need to have a beautiful interior filled with lots of natural light, beautiful open plan.
Do you think it's a case of critical mass? Build them, they will come, but also there's probably still a material percentage of the population that probably never even stepped foot in an apartment before. So if you don't know it, you fear it, you don't preference it. The more people whose friends, family, parents end up living in apartments and they end up coming over for dinner, eventually people will become less averse to it as an option.
Absolutely.
And that's just the natural way it's going to be, but it's going to take time.
I definitely think so. And I think that we are, again, really interesting space in WA where the quality of the apartment will and is becoming much more sophisticated, and people will have choice to be able to move into these apartments as we move forward over the next few years.
Proof is in the pudding here with this question. Of all the clients that you've been assisting get approvals, developing designs for, moving through the approval space, having approvals sitting there on their desk, are many of them starting to press go, or is it still a wait and see period until 2025, 2026 before they actually start to think about getting these things on the market?
We've actually got a project that is just starting construction in Midland, actually.
Of all places.
Of all places. So that's with Blue Rock Projects, doing a hybrid timber apartment building. But we are also looking at student accommodation. We're about to push a button on a project in the city. We are also doing the same for a few of our other apartment projects. I think there's been a number of factors that have contributed to people now having confidence in wanting to start construction. That is, as you say, the property values have gone up, which has meant that because construction prices back in 2022-23 went up 40-50%, it made the projects not stack up. So what that has meant is that we had to get the property values
to be a reset.
To come up, to catch up to where the construction prices were going, because otherwise they were never going to stack. So now that's happening, and I think it will continue even more moving into next year. But
they're probably banking on it, let's be honest.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
They need, and we need to. I mean, it's a necessary part of the property cycle to ensure that we do get new product into the market.
Yeah.
What's really interesting, though, is it still comes down to value generation. We need to ensure that we have the most rational, beautiful plan from a construction side of things to ensure that the projects continue to stack up, because the cost of construction is that number one key.
And that's probably where things are starting to stabilise now. Having spoken to Tim Reardon last week from the HOA, we're now seeing 1% increases.
Exactly.
And so you've got a bit more confidence at the developer level, that your builder's got a bit more confidence at the builder level that he's not going to fall over halfway through.
That's right.
And that's 10 times more critical than your builder falling over in your single house.
Exactly.
Insurances, for example, indemnities aren't there at the same level. Your builder falls over on your $500 million apartment building, you're pretty knackered. Everyone loses out of that, right?
Exactly.
So I think we're starting to get to that point where possibly builders are starting to look at it. They're starting to give proper timelines, fixed contracts, because those are the things that are going to be required. And when you've got people like Finbar, for example, leading in Belmont, you think, well, maybe sometime soon it should be able to happen for us. Yeah. But I think en masse, that's still going to be something that flows into 2025, 26 before we actually see shovels breaking dirt, which means we're still 2 to 3 years away from those apartments being able to be moved into.
Exactly. It's still obviously a lag for construction to happen. I think what's interesting is that there's been a number of projects that were carried out during and just after COVID in terms of apartment projects that really bore the brunt of those construction increases. They are now being completed, which is fantastic. It does mean that there's a lot more builder resources available to look at new projects, but we still do need some more larger scale builders in the industry.
It's a small
in WA.
pool, like a handful of builders here that could have done the building in the first place.
Exactly right. So I think that that's really important. But I think also one of the discussions that we are constantly having about our projects is what's the best way to procure a project.
Getting the materials.
But I think having a really collaborative approach with the builder, bringing them in early into a project, and work with our team to ensure the construction, the making is, again, as efficient as they need to build it as well. One lens is our design lens, and one lens is our construction lens. And both of those, they really need to be addressed from the beginning. A good example of that project, which is one that was built during the COVID timeframes, is the Claremont Hotel. Construction prices were going up so quickly when that was happening, but we worked really, really collaboratively with the builder and through the construction process to make sure that the design that was created was simple, particularly in its structural approach. It's as a renovation of a heritage building, it's a complex beast, right? But there's ways that you can try and make things simple and clean. And if anyone who's been into the Claremont, they can actually see that The front half of the building, which faces Bayview Terrace, is the heritage building. The back half is virtually new. It's where the old bottle shop was. But half of that building was just an absolute, I guess, cacophony of complexity and different levels that have been added on to and layers over the years. So we actually had to look at this and go, how do we
build this?
How do we do it? My studio director, Mark Spadaccini, was actually in the roof before construction with the structural engineer, and then when the builder was brought on, with the builder. And they were literally looking at the roof beams and drawing solutions in the roof space to try and work out how they were going to be able to build it in the most simple way. It looks simple, but it's often the hardest way to actually get it to be made, but it also needs to be the most cost effective.
Kylee, it's been a phenomenal chat today. So much context, so many stories. I really appreciate your time, and I know the thousands of people listening to this will have listened all the way till the end.
Thanks, Trent.
You're a great example of another leader in Western Australia who's going out of their way to try and help make a difference through this cycle and the cycles before. And I hope you stick around and come back again.
Thank you.
With an update on how things are going we hopefully solve more and more of these issues and get as many West Australians as we can into their own home.
Thank you very much, Trent.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!